How are you today?
Hello. Hi, how are you? Oh, I can't hear you, Ben.
There you go. Now you can hear
Yes, how are you?
me. Not bad in yourself.
I'm good, thank you. Nice to meet you.
You as well. So it already started recording at about 45-ish. Justin is working with me, so he's just going to be in the background. So I'm basically ready to get started. All right.
All right, let's
So
do
here we go.
this.
Welcome back, everyone, to Pick Your Brains podcast. Today, I actually get to do something really awesome, and today we have social worker number 2 on here, who happens to now be an Amazon well-selling author. She's coming out with volume 2 of her book, which is called Latinx. How do I pronounce that name again? God dang it.
No, it's confusing. It's Latinx, Latin A, and social work.
Okay, that sounds about right. Volume 2 will be set to come out on October 5th. So this is basically an episode for everyone to learn about yourself. I'm going to add in a little bit of me, and like you saw with one of your co-authors already, who was the first social worker on here. It was actually a very fun conversation. So let's get into this. All right. My first question for you is, what year did you approximately immigrate here with your family from Ecuador?
1977. That's a good question. I never thought about the year. I always thought about how old I was. So I was
So
about
you're about the same age as Madeline, if I'm correct.
probably. We don't talk about ages.
Yeah, well, the only time I ever really have actually cited age was in the past to complain about certain things just about where I am, but that's for another day. In your household, because I've had a lot of Dominican and Puerto Rican friends over the years, was Spanish considered the first spoken language? And then
Yes,
had to go out
yes.
and learn English elsewhere.
That's right. That's right. So Spanish was the primary language, and I started learning English when I went to school. But an interesting fun fact is that I first went to kindergarten and it was a Greek kindergarten. So I learned Greek before I learned English. But when I went to first
Which,
grade
if you don't mind me asking, which borough of the city did you grow up in?
in Queens, in Astoria, Queens.
Okay, that's why, because you just mentioned Greek, and I completely remember that is very predominantly Greek area
Mm-hmm.
where most of the Greeks did historically originally. That was probably the first part of New York they were immigrating to, coming straight from the Greek islands.
That's right. And it was fun to learn it. And then I forgot it as soon as I started learning English. And so I'm bilingual. I speak Spanish and English now. I wish I was trilingual, but I don't remember Greek.
I wish I had taken Spanish when I was much younger, but I had an interesting experience with this because when I worked at GNC back in the very early part of the last decade, most of the people that I worked with spoke Spanish, but it was mostly Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. So that's a little bit of a very tricky Spanish to learn, but not impossible to understand once you're exposed and around it after a while.
That's
I was
right.
able to understand it, but they have one of the most trickiest Spanishes ever. And I actually happen to have a friend who's about little older than me at the beginning of the millennials, who right now she's married, she works for Amazon, and she's down in Florida, but she lived in Spain coming from the Dominican islands, so her Spanish is a little more European.
There's so many different dialects in Spanish. And so you're right about that. We're not monolithic. We're not all the same. There's so many different dialects, and even words are described differently and understood differently. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
There are 3 different versions of the Hebrew language, and when you grow up and you're bar mitzvah, what you're really learning is the Eastern European version of it, or let's see if I remember this correctly. Most Israeli immigrants were refugees from Eastern Europe, where they either went to Israel or they came here, but they were Ashkenaz. The other dialect is from the North African region, and that's, if I remember correctly, Sephardi, so more from the Spain area. So I just thought I would throw that in there just for a little interest. Now, when did you graduate? So if you were born in 1976, would you say you graduated college at about early 2000s?
No, I did not graduate college at that time. I started college in the early 2000s. So my story is very different from the norm that you go to high school, then you go to college, then you graduate college. It's very different. I actually did not make it the first two rounds when I started college because there was so much that I was going through. I was living by myself in New York. I started college in Florida. It didn't work out well. I came back. I dropped out, and then I started college when my daughter was 1 years old. So that was in the 2000s, around 2003, and I didn't graduate with my master's till 2010. So it took about 7 years to get my associates, my bachelor's, and my master's, but I did it in 2000.
I have a similar story because unfortunately, let me just say this. I've seen you post about this before, but I come from a very predominantly rich area up close to Danbury, Connecticut. Unfortunately, the norm is most of them graduated college within 4 to 5 years. So I exceeded you by 1.5 years because unfortunately, with my situation's a little different since parents had divorced at 5 years old. So unfortunately, even though both have been prevalent in my life, I was still brought up in high school with a single parent. So in this area of Westchester, where you're bordering Connecticut, most of them never really understood the idea of a divorce or exactly how it affected people. And a lot of that happens to be because you're dealing with higher tax in income brackets up in that area. For example, we did have people that I knew who were from, some kids I grew up with, I knew came from Mexican families. Other kids I knew, but it was very rare to have that up in an area where you basically need two parents making six figures to afford buying a house. And where I lived with my mother was what we considered lower income housing, which exists in a lot of these small towns. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, which is it's possible for people like myself to grow up, on what we call the other side of town. But I think nowadays that's a little difficult for people to be able to process. But it's not that it's my experience. That does exist. If you ever watch the show One Tree Hill with Chad Michael Murray, that even covered that whole concept that is uniquely possible.
Yeah,
and I'm sure you've seen that within your own field. And in fact, Madeline even told me on her interview and separately offline, well, she lived in the Midwest. So what do you think happens in the Midwest in most of these ridiculously conservative states?
Mm-hmm. No,
Most of
absolutely.
their populations who are like me are literally not getting the best job opportunities, where, and I'll go into a little bit of my situation later. Now, this was a question I had wanted to ask you because it was from your own story. I saw you worked at Rosa Mexicana, which I have a very close friend of mine who's in her semi-early to mid-30s. Her name is Cindy. She's Afro-Dominican. She worked there also. Now, did you butt heads with management over there? Because she complained to me one day that the management is just incompetent, according to her.
I didn't butt heads with management. I was I worked really well with management, and I actually trained a lot of managers in in learning the restaurant and how the front of the house works with servers. And I worked at the one on 62nd and Columbus, which is the biggest.
That's the one she worked at, but
Mhm.
it must have gotten worse wise because she didn't have a good experience there.
Yeah, no, I had a great experience there. I was there for 7 years, and it was a wonderful experience. And I was able to pay for my living arrangements with my daughter for 7 years as a single mom and go to school full time. So I had an amazing experience.
Okay, so another question that I had. I'm trying to understand the whole college experience with social work. And then it dawned on me when I've seen other social workers post on LinkedIn about this. I had no idea there were other things that you could do with it, because when I was going through college in the 2000s, I chose business. But from my understanding, most people did prerequisites in psychology for that. Could someone who came from a business background potentially enroll into a master's degree program in social work? Or would I still have to do the prerequisite in psychology? Because that's what happened over at Mercy College. Most people did what we call behavioral sciences.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what each college or social work program is requesting or requiring. So you would have to really look at the college that you want to pursue the social work degree in and look at their prerequisites. But what I do know is that many people change careers. We have lawyers that became social workers. We have doctors. We have many people just leave the corporate industry and become social workers. So I know it's definitely possible.
I would consider it under this situation, but there's really only two things that I didn't even actually realize you could do with it, because I thought they made more sense for a business major. One of them was a grant writer, but I know it sort of makes sense to come from a social work background if maybe you're writing grants for a nonprofit organization. But with grant writer, I always looked at that as a business background, like myself, makes more sense because it's a business document. However, I realized that looking at it from an open-minded perspective, it's possible to do both. But would you be able to explain why a social work background for a business document might not be a bad idea?
I think that social workers can do anything and everything that's out there. And we do it so well because there's so many different skill sets that we acquire that are great in business, that are great in grant writing, that are great in administration and nonprofit leadership. So becoming a social worker doesn't just make you an individual that's in clinical practice. You could be in politics, you could be anywhere. So I think
I
with
was
what
about to say something related to that, because in the 2000s, the only jobs that they were literally trying to push on people, which was for recruiting on their aspect, was Department of Social Services, Department of Social Services. Yeah, that should be fine. Was literally DSS, Department of Social Services, and then basically clinical therapy. So it's nice to know that there were other things that you could do. So you have to go by 10:30.
well, I have a podcast I'm recording today too. So you're interviewing me and then I'm interviewing someone else. How do you like that
Okay.
today?
So I had a very fun question. Would you consider me for a spot on your show at some point as
Of
well?
course, you would be awesome on my show at some point. The thing is, the show, it focuses on individual and leaders that are doing amazing things for the Latino community. So
Okay.
we highlight individuals, leaders, authors, anyone that's doing and serving and supporting the Latino community.
Okay, perfect. All right. Now, the biggest question I had with some of your content, I saw you worked at Make-A-Wish Foundation. Would you say you had problems with the management over there? Because I worked in the nonprofit sector myself, and honestly, at the end of my time at Goodwill, the manager I was working with was just a complete moron. And I'm saying this in a nice way. He was not real. He came from a marketing background, trying to work in a nonprofit organization, and he just didn't understand how to work with people.
You know what it is, Ben, is that all the experience that I've had in all of the employments and industries, it's never been perfect. There's never perfect days, there are never perfect relationships. But what I do is like, of course, I've had some bad moments at Rosa Mexicano. Maybe I didn't make enough money that night, or I had like a moment with a client or a manager, and make it wish the same thing. It's never perfect, but I can't say with in details like anything really truly negative about the organization that I was in for 7 years, especially because we did such amazing work. I do know that the work that I did helped reach thousands of kids in different communities that were not accessing a wish. So I was very much a champion of ensuring that there was access and they knew about these incredible resources as a wish for kids with a chronic illness in different communities, especially communities of color and kids that were predominantly raised by Spanish speaking parents or just undocumented or immigrants. So that was the work that I did. I think that in all organizations and nonprofit leadership, and even in corporate, all organizations, there's still some work to be done. And that means that all the leaders need to really think about how to be an anti-racist, or how to manage your team so they don't get burned out, or how to support your team so they feel valued and they feel like they are doing the work and being appreciated. And I think if everyone really started learning those techniques and seeking counsel from social workers and consultants to support them in building team leadership and building staffing and building just teamwork and really making sure that their teams are feeling valued and appreciated. A lot of times people won't leave with a sour taste in their mouth. Um, and
I
so
didn't leave Goodwill with a sour taste in my mouth. I actually got laid off because of COVID at the very start. They tried to summon me back 4 months later, and I just said no, because not because I don't want to, but because it was the same manager. And a little story I'm going to share is their assistant manager last year when I went shopping for whatever reason, when she saw me in the store, she made a very poor, ignorant comment on her half, and she also, by the way, happened to be a woman of color. So I just left it alone. And I'll tell you exactly what I said. She basically said, "Oh, the former employee now comes to shop here." And then I rebutted to her and said, "Is this a problem? Because I'm just coming in to take a look." In other words, what I see that people define as I see racism in two different ways. Everybody does it in some way. And just because, this doesn't mean I haven't experienced it either. And especially for somebody who is on the spectrum, I have had, and this is a discussion that me and my mother were just having a couple of days ago. I got blackballed from reasonably good opportunities because no one could make accommodations, even in this area, or didn't know how to make accommodations unless you're in a clinical healthcare setting, in which case then and there they don't mind because, you're working with doctors and nurses. Unfortunately, the rest of the corporate world is just not patient. I get it, but you can't, in Goodwill's case, say you work with people with disabilities, but then not accommodate them.
yeah, I think that your point is more about discrimination.
But
Instead of
not just discrimination, it's also most of these senior leaders, my parents' age and a little older, they're looking at 20th century ideas. They're looking at what worked back then. They're not looking at what would work now. It's just they're using outdated practices on how to run an organization. So I just look at it as I think there was a time where maybe certain things they did were acceptable, but it's no longer acceptable today.
No, I agree with you. I think a lot of times people are stuck in their ways, like you said, and they're not looking of innovative and new ideas and people that are coming in to share their new experiences and skills. And they're just doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And that's not something that helps transform organizations. So you're right about that.
I don't consider that to be racist or anti-racist. I just look at this as basically where I went to school, most of those people wouldn't that I went to school with, they wouldn't be sitting down with someone like you doing what we're doing today because, when you come from families with a lot of money, what schools are they typically going to? They're going to large brand name universities. They're playing sports with one another. They're going into sectors like finance and tech. Do you really think they're going into a nonprofit like you are, or in my case, clinical healthcare?
Well, you know what? I think there's a lot of social workers that are
Yes,
from predominantly white, privileged neighborhoods as well. So,
actually, that's something that I actually find myself not agreeing with either. I think social workers should represent. I think every, I think everyone should be able to have a social worker or a therapist who they can at least semi-relate to. Because honestly, I had mostly white therapists, and I thought they didn't always do a good job. That's just something I'm going to share with you. I would have probably preferred to sit down with someone like you instead, who probably had a better shot of listening. But unfortunately, because when I was going to therapy, how old do you think most of the therapists were? My mother's age.
right, right.
So we're looking at different coping techniques that worked back in the 20th century, but we're not looking at the fact that maybe I would do better with somebody like you in a clinical setting.
That's a really good point, Ben, because the reason why we started sharing our personal narratives in our books is because we wanted to help build a pipeline for more social workers or more students or more people to really understand what social work is, and especially individuals that identify as Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, and are bilingual, because our communities need, like what you were saying, someone to support them that knows their language and can relate and can support and be there with them. So that's a really good point that you're making. But then I do
Or
agree.
even somebody like me
Yes, I was going to say that. Yes.
who would actually benefit from learning from somebody else for a change. Because honestly, I don't call that, in a sense, white privilege. I call that more, you're probably only listening and doing paperwork the other percentage of the time, and you're not really listening for the sake of listening. This is
Mm,
something that over a 15-year career in retail, I finally realized about most of my own community. They don't do this. They don't want to listen because half the time it's either the phone is the problem, or let's be honest, they don't know how to react or how to advise. I'm not
ah,
saying that's true for everyone, because I had my last very close white friend, Ricky, who is 1 year older than me. He's actually a very good listener, but that's because he wants to be.
that's great. It's good that you have good listeners as
Are you there?
friends. I'm here. I'm right here.
Yeah, okay. My last good friend, he listens because he's sympathetic.
Yeah.
Most do not want to listen because they have their own problems going on.
Mm,
That's fine. But this is what I'm saying. This is probably the first time you're hearing this from somebody else, that I wouldn't mind, sitting down with even someone like you, because I'm open-minded. But that can become a problem in my own community.
hmm. I hear that.
I don't know if I was the first one to say that to you, or you've heard it before, but I'm sure you've heard it before.
I think it's important to just be honest about it. Sometimes, you know, people aren't listening, or you don't feel listened to, or you don't feel, and that's a lot of what we talk about in the book. It's like not feeling like you have space in the room, or not feeling like you belong, or you're not feeling like you're being heard. So I love that you're mentioning this, because we totally believe that this is happening in so many different areas. And we want to make sure that people understand how sensitive this is and how they can change and do things differently. So the individual that's experiencing that doesn't feel like they're not being heard. So I love that you brought that up.
Thank you. And then I'm going to be doing a couple topics that I told Madeline about, which are my other podcast format, Opinionated Collective, is a panel style debate. We have a couple episodes that I want to bring you in on. One is a gender debate. The other is going to be a social work topic, which I'll come up with. So I'll let you know about that. But lastly, two questions I wanted to ask you. Can you walk us through, in your last few minutes, the process of how you wrote your book, and if you have any recommendations on YouTube and LinkedIn growth? Because I'm in the middle of starting to grow my channel.
Okay, YouTube, I definitely don't have any recommendations, but writing the book was a collective effort. So it was, I do have a team that supports me. So, and they work with me in my company. And so this was not done alone, and I have to give them 100% recognition. I have people that help with my social media, my communication strategist that edits, my strategic relationship manager that brings people together with me. So first, it's really identifying what is it that you want to give the audience? What is it that what's the message? And so when you really kind of figure out what your message is, then you start putting together an outline. And once you have the outline, you ask yourself these questions of what does your story want to convey? And so we had writers guidelines. And we all received the same writers guidelines, and we followed the guidelines. So the stories aren't the similar because we're all so different, but we had a guide that can help us keep on track. And once we all wrote our stories, I met with them individually and we talked about it and we read it together and we looked at it. And there were moments that they were very moving. There were very moving moments because I'm here with them and they're allowing me in, sharing their personal story, which was beautiful. And then once they felt comfortable, we submitted it to our publisher. And then the publisher goes through editing. So then the editor works with the writer and goes through the editing process. And then once they approve the final edit, then it goes to the proofreader. So having a great publishing company and a publisher is important because that's your team. You are just the person that is sitting there and putting all of your thoughts on paper.
So the project manager in my case, because that's actually what this podcast has mostly been showcasing for me, which is the ability to project manage.
Yes.
Which, unfortunately, my only big issue with the corporate world is this: they want credentials if you're going to be trying to upgrade in the healthcare field, which I semi understand, but that's one of those outdatedly stupid ideas that really could use a new thought process on. As much as I wouldn't mind getting the degree, it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Whether I'm taking out loans to become a data analyst or getting a project manager certificate or financing it out of pocket, which gets quite expensive. I understand why they want the credential and to believe in the 20th century that this was how you got promoted. But in this time, if that's the case with rampant inflation, then maybe you need to think about hiring people that are already doing some type of a project management of even just something as simple as a podcast. That would showcase them better than trying to say, go for a Lean Sigma 6 certification, because this is an industry certification.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm sorry, but what worked in the 20th century isn't working in the 21st century. And how am I expected to pay for this out of pocket?
You're right. 100%.
Especially when my biggest knock with the government right now, student loan forgiveness. This was not general. This was completely, the people who are complaining about it were in occupations like yourself. You're not complaining about it because you went into a health field, much like I went into clinical healthcare. But in the community that I come from, half the reason I don't have as many friends as I used to, and I'll tell you exactly why, is because they all didn't want to see me get my loans forgiven because they paid off theirs. And I remember flipping one of them off and saying, that's your problem. You got to get yourself a nice, cushy little six-figure corporate job at a credit union while I was stuck in retail for 15 years. Why
Mhm.
does it matter if your supposed tax dollars are paying for my loans? I mean, really. You see, and this is for somebody like me who I said came from a rich community. That's how they look at things, which
Yeah.
is actually, by the way, between you and me, that's ignorant.
Yeah. Totally.
So
You said you
my
had one more question for me.
yes, I just want to finish on two questions. First question is, what would you say to someone in my case who, unlike most of his friends, can't even afford to buy a house these days? Would you say that the amount of opportunities I was offered were not sufficient to what everybody else got?
I don't know. I don't know if I would say that because I can't afford to buy a house right now. And I'm a graduate with from NYU. So there's right now, it's like what you said, it's inflation, it's not equitable. Things aren't being made accessible to many, many people because of how high the real estate market is right now. So it's unfair because even middle class, sometimes I feel like communities that have a lower income are buying houses much faster than middle income communities because of some of the resources that are out there for them. So I can't
Well,
really.
in the financial realm, most of those programs have specific rules and regulations to
Right.
them
So and
that
I'm not an expert in that.
unfortunately,
That's right.
that's an area I know a little something about, but that would be a separate conversation. Collabs, is that considered a nonprofit organization?
I'm not a nonprofit. I'm a for-profit organization. So I moved away from the nonprofit sector and I'm a for-profit. It's a clinical and consulting company. So I'm a clinical therapist and I also consult for corporate companies, healthcare, academia, schools, organizations, and it's a for-profit business.
Do you have remote opportunities?
The remote opportunities are for clinicians. And so if you are clinical, if
So
you're,
non-clinical would have to go on site.
no, there's no on-site opportunities.
Not right now, anyway.
Right. And there's not right now. It doesn't make sense for us to have an office whenever I have two offices that I see clients in, but it doesn't make sense to bring a whole team into an office environment. The world has changed. You don't need that anymore. And people need to understand that. And you save money and you're also making your team and staff feel more comfortable and they actually work better when.
Some My sector right now, unfortunately, you're not going to get away from the office real estate in the medical industry anytime soon. Especially with hospitals. Now, as doctors get ready, okay. Thanks for coming by.
Well, I want to just say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for having me today. This has been really fun. I feel like we can talk for so long.
Yeah.
You have some really great questions. Do you have any last minute thoughts?
Last minute thoughts are as follows. I definitely appreciate that you came by, and at the very least, now we have a better understanding versus what I see with people's content, because what I see with content is completely different from actually getting to talk to the person. Now, the only thing I do want to say is when I'm commenting at how the content comes off, which to me, I agree or disagree with it. That what you see is what you get with me, but I'm the same person who comments when you come on something like this. So
Mhm.
there's really not much of a distinct difference. My only closing thought is that I wish, for people like you and me, that some programs were a little more fair. That would be my closing thought, and that the government could have been a little more generous on the student loan forgiveness. But they did what they wanted to do because, you have a bunch of older people in office
That's
and they're
right.
living in a different time frame. So I hope you guys learned something. Let's thank Erica for coming by, and I'll see you at the next one.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
You're welcome. All right, bye.